Tonight on Remote Cabin Radio, we open part 1 of our 4-part series, Sasquatch Sightings, Tales from Joint Base Lewis-McChord. Here, among the shadowy expanses of Washington's forested lowlands and mist-covered hillsides, lies an enigmatic wilderness, a place of dark secrets and hidden things. Although only miles away from the bustling heart of Seattle and Tacoma, Joint Base Lewis-McChord sits on the edge of a rugged landscape that swiftly sheds all signs of urban life as it stretches southeastward to the looming slopes of Mount Rainier. The lands around the base are a mix of protected military zones, dense forests, and ancient wilderness. Here, narrow backroads snake between towering Douglas firs, and sunlight seldom penetrates the thick canopy, leaving the land in a perpetual dusk. Locals speak in hushed tones of strange sightings and eerie sounds that echo from the woods at night, while soldiers stationed here report sightings of shadowy figures and strange, unexplainable tracks found in the mud. As we venture into the heart of these rarely seen lands, a question lingers. Why does this place, steeped in military discipline and scientific precision, continue to attract stories of the unknown? And what is it about these ancient woods, just beyond the reach of civilization, that calls to something hidden, a creature that remains out of sight, seen only by those who stray too far into the trees? These lands have long been home to indigenous peoples, including the Nisqually, Puyallup, and Squaxin Island tribes. Their histories are steeped in a profound respect for the land, rich oral traditions, and tales of unseen forces inhabiting the wilderness. For centuries, they spoke of spirits, strange creatures, and powerful beings dwelling in these untouched forests, where the boundary between the natural and supernatural often feels thin. As the United States expanded westward, Fort Lewis, now part of Joint Base Lewis-McChord, was established in 1917. Originally a military training site, it evolved into one of the largest joint military installations in the country, stretching across the southern Puget Sound region. The base lies near the Nisqually River, surrounded by dense forests and remote terrain, amplifying the eerie isolation felt by those who work and live here. In 1989, during routine Army training maneuvers near the river, something terrifying and unexpected occurred. Soldiers trained to face any danger found themselves confronted with something far beyond the scope of their mission. What began as a simple reconnaissance exercise soon turned into a close encounter with the unknown. Just a few years later, in 1993, another soldier's chilling experience added to the growing number of strange sightings at the base. These encounters aren't just rumors or campfire stories. They come from men trained to observe, assess, and survive in any terrain situation. But what happens when they come face to face with something no amount of training could ever prepare them for? The following accounts are their true stories. The year is 1989 at Joint Base Lewis-McChord. This story was recounted by Todd Nees, an Iraq veteran and staff sergeant from Sandy, Oregon. A friend of mine began his Army career with the 2nd Battalion, 75th Ranger Regiment, stationed at the base near Tacoma, Washington. During training exercises along the Nisqually River, a river flowing from the southern slopes of Mount Rainier through dense Cascade Forest, dividing Pierce and Thurston counties, he experienced something unforgettable. It was a routine operation. One of the soldiers was sent to swim across the river and recon the opposite side. After slipping up the embankment, he disappeared into the thick forest beyond. Moments later, a blood-curdling scream echoed across the river. The young soldier came barreling back down the slope, crashing through the underbrush in a state of sheer panic. When he finally crossed back, he was nearly incoherent, claiming that he had snuck up on a creature as surprised as he was, a Bigfoot. The massive figure had bolted in the opposite direction, snapping branches as it charged through the brush. The other rangers, hearing the commotion, quickly crossed over to investigate. In the area, they found large, unmistakable footprints pressed deep into the soil, marks of something heavy that had recently passed. The encounter stayed with the young soldier, who left the army not long afterward. But his story lives on as one of the strange events whispered among rangers who train along the Nisqually. One of the other stories involved a company of army rangers on a night ambush. Sometime after they'd gotten into position, they heard someone or something stalking them. They maintained fire discipline, waiting for what they thought would be the rest of the Op 4 unit they were supposed to hit. But the figure was alone, and as it approached their position, it paused. Then it proceeded to circle their perimeter. The ranger who tells the story marveled at the intruder's expertise. After completing its recon, the figure slowly backed up the way it came and disappeared into the night, leaving a distinct odor behind. It seems like everyone I meet who was at Louis had a Bigfoot story or knew someone who did. If you're ex-military, you might have an in with those folks, although I couldn't tell you how best to approach them, especially the rangers. You know how they can be with us mere mortals. Todd Nees re-enlisted in the army and was deployed to Iraq in 2010 to 2011. Upon his return home, Todd talked freely about his own sighting and recounts that unusual event here. April 3rd, 1993, was a day that will always be seared in my mind as if it were yesterday. As a sergeant in Charlie Company, 1,249th Combat Engineers, it was business as usual as we headed up into the dense, temperate rainforest of the coastal range in northwestern Oregon. On that particular day, our mission was to conduct training on private timberland near Saddle Mountain, just east of the coastal resort town of Seaside. We would be executing demolitions operations at 3 rock quarries. Each site had a unique battle scenario to accomplish. At the first site, we practiced cutting charges, essentially slicing through steel I-beams with C4 plastic explosive. The second site held a complex obstacle, consisting of a field of surface-laid anti-tank mines, followed by a triple-strand concertina wire fence. We were to clear a vehicle lane through both. The third and last training area was situated in yet another gravel quarry on a hillside that overlooked the second blast site. Here, our mission was to emplace a cratering charge. As the name implies, this type of operation involves the making of a rather large hole. Generally, this is done to sever a road, thus denying the enemy its use. While at the second blast site, there was an unusual event which, in hindsight, may have been related to my sighting. While I was directing my squad to emplace their charges next to the anti-tank mines, there was a rather loud, crescendoing yell that emanated from the west end of the minefield. At that moment, I was bent over, placing my own charge. Upon hearing this somewhat shrill noise, I immediately stood up and sought out the perpetrator, as we were under orders to practice noise discipline during the exercise, in case the enemy were nearby. As I glanced around the minefield, I was surprised to find all of my men still busily preparing their charges and not, as I suspected, goofing off. I shrugged my shoulders and went back to work. In hindsight, it seemed to me that the sound came from farther back in the tree line. It should be noted that absent a standard issue shaped charge, we had a backhoe pre-dig a starter hole, After emplacing several bags of diesel-soaked ammonium nitrate into the aforementioned hole, we packed the charge. Once again, the area was cleared, and I initiated the dual-primed M60 fuse igniters. I took my place in the waiting convoy and, per standard operating procedure, we began the descent down the winding, single-lane road to the safety staging area. As a squad leader, I had the privilege of requisitioning my own Humvee. Ours was the second vehicle of a 5-vehicle convoy, 2 Humvees up front, 2 covered deuce-and-a-half trucks filled with troops, and the commander's Humvee taking up the rear. I sat behind the driver's seat and, as we were descending the graveled road down towards the staging area, I had the opportunity to sit back and enjoy the scenery. It is just second nature to me to look for wildlife. It was a rare sunny day in April. I had my window unzipped for a better view. Rounding a corner, I could see the rock quarry where we did our second blast less than an hour earlier. Standing right out in the open, in the middle of the gravel pit, were 3 jet-black, bipedal creatures. They stood in line, shoulder to shoulder, staring directly at our convoy as it descended the hillside across from them. Between us was a ravine, populated with 8 to 12-year-old Douglas fir and hemlock. At a distance of several hundred meters, I could not make out facial features or gender, but there was no doubt what I was looking at were not humans. Had these creatures been standing in front of a backdrop of trees, I most likely would not have seen them at all. But in this case, there stood 3 dark black figures contrasted against a light gray cliff of basalt on a bright sunny day. In the middle stood what I assumed to be the alpha male of the group, as it towered a full head above the 2 creatures that flanked it. I would estimate it to have stood approximately 9 feet high, with the flanking creatures approaching 7 feet in height. Their silhouette was unique in that their heads sat directly on their shoulders with no visible neck. They all displayed broad, square shoulders and barreled chests which tapered down to a svelte waistline, unlike the creature seen in the Patterson-Gimlin film of 1967. The arms of these beings hung well past their knees. In the case of the 2 flanking creatures, they were exhibiting a swaying motion, rocking side to side, as the larger creature stood as still as a statue. All the while I was staring at the creatures, we were bounding down a dirt road with the occasional hedge of blackberry and Scotch bloom obscuring my view. I had approximately 25 seconds of viewing time. Being in shock and not knowing whether I would lose sight of them at any second, I stared in disbelief. Once the vehicle rounded a sharp corner, I knew I had seen the last of them. I fell back into my seat with a mixture of shock for what I had witnessed and an odd sense of depression. It's hard to explain what goes through one's mind in such a moment. My head began to swim with questions. They do exist, and not just a solitary beast, but a group of them. How could they exist and not be discovered? What do I do now? I felt the sudden urge to tell someone, but who? I had seen something scientifically, if not historically important, and someone should be notified. There must be some authority that needs this information. I began to make a mental checklist. The U.S. Fish and Wildlife? No. The Forest Service? No. The zoo? No. The police? Hell no. Then who? And more importantly, who would believe me anyway? Reluctantly, I decided, like most people do, to keep my mouth shut. Here I was, a family man, a vice president of a shipping company, and a non-commissioned officer in the Army National Guard. I had worked long and hard for my reputation, and yet, with one simple sentence, I saw Bigfoot, I could throw it all away. If I knew what was good for me, I would never tell a soul. Arriving back at the staging area, I immediately jogged back up the road in a futile effort to get one more look at these amazing creatures. Unfortunately, there was a knoll that blocked my view of the gravel pit. My activity hadn't gone unnoticed. When I turned back to the waiting convoy, my first sergeant was standing in front of the Humvee, glaring at me as if I'd lost my mind. He motioned for me to return to the vehicles. When I got to him, he inquired if I had seen something. I hesitated and replied, "Nothing, Sarge." That was the end of my first encounter with the creatures known as Sasquatch. Who would have thought that after my time in Iraq and the intervening years, I would still be thinking about them, wondering if I had seen what I had actually seen. To this day, I still believe in Sasquatch. I've told very few people about my sighting, and when I do, it always comes with a disclaimer that I'm not crazy. I'm a trained observer. I've done many outdoor survival schools, including mountain warfare, and I know what I saw that day. And if you were to ask me to give you a brief description, I would tell you this. They look like us, only bigger, stronger, and decidedly more primal. They had the unmistakable qualities of an evolved hominid, and yet not human in the least. They were like beings from another time, something that is out of place in our modern world. I have yet to come to terms with the fact that they exist, just as much as I am amazed that I had the chance to see them. As we conclude this first chapter of our exploration into the stories from Joint Base Lewis-McChord, we're left with more questions than answers. These trained soldiers, skilled in the art of survival, encountered something that defied reason. Were these beings guardians of the wilderness or relics of a forgotten world? As night falls over the forests of the Pacific Northwest and the wind whispers through the trees, we're reminded that some mysteries linger in the shadows. Join us next time for more stories from Fort Lewis. This is Remote Cabin Radio, where history and mystery come alive. Good night. If you have a story you'd like to share on the channel, whether in an interview, adapted for narration, or even off the record, please reach out by email at remotecabinradio@gmail.com. Thank you.